Hello, and welcome to Archives and Records Simplified. These videos are aimed at people looking for basic knowledge about archives and records management, although at times I will also touch slightly on information and library science. These videos are designed to provide bite-sized chunks, which means that almost every video will be less than 15 minutes. These videos are honestly for everyone, and comments and suggestions are always more than welcome. About me, Sean Macmillan, I'm an archivist based in London, and you can learn more about me via my LinkedIn profile, to which there is a link posted below. And I'll also post a transcript and notes also if you struggle at any point to understand my accent. And lastly, if you enjoy these videos, I would be extremely grateful if you could kindly like, subscribe and share. Thanks again. Alright, so this one is an introduction to archival catalogues. Okay, so the main learning outcomes from this is that archival catalogues are hierarchical. That is to say that archival catalogues tend to have a tree-like structure compared to other forms of catalogue, which can often be a bit more flat. Context and order matter in archival catalogues, perhaps more in other ones. And also maybe the archival cataloguing is possibly a bit more subjective and malleable than other forms of cataloguing. Okay, so what is a catalogue? Essentially, an archival catalogue is a finding aid. It's a tool that allows us to navigate archival collections and understand what is there, and perhaps more importantly, where the materials are. I would think of a catalogue as being much like an inventory, but standardized to contain more detail and structured in a set way. What I would say is that most archival catalogues, specifically in the UK, will follow certain standards such as ISA-G or NCA rules if they're adding names and indexes. However, some institutions can create catalogues slightly differently from others. If you look at certain institutions, what some institutions might describe as a file, others might describe as an item. If you're completely new to this topic and you're slightly unsure of what I'm talking about here, the best thing I can recommend is just persevere. This should become clearer as we go on. Another thing I should indicate here is that you could also say a catalogue in many respects is as much a sort of intellectual construct as it is a physical one. As you begin to organise items into groups and subgroups, those groupings can often be very much intellectual and not always physical. And again, that will make more sense as we progress. So it's also really important to note the sort of structure of archival catalogues. So I would say you'd want to keep in mind that archival catalogues tend to be hierarchical. And what that means is that a collection will tend to have something like a more tree-like structure rather than being sort of flat, maybe like a database, for example. This is to say that you describe the collection at different levels. So you might come across a concept known as the funds, which often means the entire collection, although it should be said some people would challenge the validity of that term on the basis that if you have a collection that's went to an institution, but some records have ended up elsewhere, the term funds can be a bit misleading because there might be items elsewhere out there. But generally speaking, you'll hear the term funds used to describe the entirety of the collection. And collection level, which is what you'll tend to see when you look at a catalogue for the first time, is the highest type of description, and this tends to describe the collection overall. Beneath the collection level, the catalogue will often subdivide into other areas, often known as subfunds or series. These are then categories that you sort items into, and again, this is more of an intellectual type of sorting. What you'll tend to find is that the larger the catalogue, the more it will subdivide, and this is when you get into sort of sub-series, file and item level, etc. In some cases, you might even get sub-series, or you might even go below item and go into piece level. Maybe the best way I could sort of explain this is if you think of the planet Earth as being a bit like the funds or the collection level, the continents might be the examples of a sub-funds. Say it's Europe, the different countries might be examples of series, the cities could be examples of sub-series and so on, and you get the idea that it becomes more specific the further you go on. And that analogy works as well, because you could say if Earth's really a funds, if the Mars rover is out of orbit. So yeah, that might be a good analogy to help understand this. So again, I've mentioned that the archival catalogue tends to be a bit like a tree chart, and you'll see this in this diagram here. In this image, you can see that there's a sort of collection level at the very top, and you can see that it breaks down further as you go down the next levels. Now, it should be said that, again, this is just to emphasize, this is an intellectual construct. So the item level, or the piece, that would be maybe an individual folder or an individual item within a box, and the subseries or file level might be the box itself. So as I say, it's very much intellectual above that. So for example, the main series or the subfunds level would possibly relate to a collection of boxes. So again, you get the idea that the collection tends to get a lot more specific the further down the tree you go. Another way of putting it might be to see collection level descriptions as being analogous to a sort of basic JPEG, and an item level description is the equivalent of a high quality TIFF. And what I would say by this is that if you only catalogued a collection to collection level, you would be describing the whole collection within sort of one finding aid or one finding aid entry. But if you catalogued a collection right down to item level, then you would be describing it in far more detail. So for example, to go back to my earth analogy, a sort of collection level description of the earth might be a one-page summary of what the earth is, whereas an item level might be one where you'd write an entry or write a description of every single city in the earth. So you could imagine how the quantity and the complexity of the descriptions grows exponentially the further you go down and the more specific you get. A few important points to keep in mind. Shelf marks often indicate the structure of an archival catalogues. I've mentioned that not all archival institutions are consistent. So for example, what some institutions might call a file, other institutions might call a subseries. So for example, at one institution, a box might be the file, whereas in other institutions, or other catalogues even, they might even describe a box as a subseries. And even between collections, sometimes different archivists can have different approaches, and sometimes different collections can pose different challenges. What I would say is that the order of an archival collection really matters. So this is one of the areas where I would say that archival cataloguing maybe differs from other ones, in a sense that you really want to try retain the order. You really want to pay attention to the context that items are in. Often you figure out what an item's value is, or what its content is, or what it relates to, based on its relationship with the other items around it. And lastly, box lists are not catalogues. Box lists are very useful, and that's an essential part of the cataloguing process, but they tend not to have that sort of structure and the sort of detail that you'd be looking for in a properly catalogued collection. So just to make this point and hopefully make this topic a lot clearer, this is an example of a random set of shelf marks. So the random collection is XX1. So XX1 would be the first subfunds, XXX11 would be the first subfunds, first series, XXX111 would be first subfunds, first series, first subseries, and that might be the box. And then XXX1111 would be the first subfunds, first series, first subseries, and the first file, which in this case might be a folder within that box. So you get the idea. Generally, the longer the numbers get, the more specific you're getting, and the sort of smaller the unit that you're moving into. Okay, so a quick word about organising archival catalogues. Essentially, you usually want to preserve a catalogue in as close to the order as you received it. This is very much preferred. Sometimes, though, this isn't possible, and if not, the next best thing you might want to look at is function. So that's where you look at individual records, you consider why they were created, and you try sort of organise them across those sort of functional reasons or those functional identifications. Beyond that, and I would say this is often a last resort, you might organise a collection by format. So for example, if it's a complex collection of digital materials, audiovisual and paper records, you might have a separate series specifically for digital files. But generally, personally, I tend to avoid that, as I often think sometimes the format can be incidental. What I would say is if you're working in personal collections, chronology can often be really useful. Another useful tip for personal collections is separating professional work from personal life. And if you're ever working with organisational collections, then arranging items by different departments can be really helpful. So say, for example, you're working in the archives of a small business, you might note that the business records are separate from the advertising records or the financial records from any other type. So it's just something that the departments can sometimes be a little bit easier on that, in terms of the information is maybe easier to sort into distinct paths. Okay, and just a last word on original order, because that is the main thing that archivists look at. Just if it's not clear, try think of original order as being a bit like a crime scene. The idea being that you want to maintain things as closely as possible, as close as possible to the way that you found them. And again, I think the crime scene analogy is probably the best way to describe it, because even though a crime scene might be very messy and hazardous, that in itself might be evidence of something. And it kind of works the same way with an archival collection. If you come across a collection which is very messy and disorganized, obviously you want to make it as accessible as possible, and sometimes rearranging it is completely, unavoidable and you have to do it. But sometimes what seems messy to you, that might actually be evidence of something. And I think that there is some balance between making it cohesive, understandable, and logical, but also retaining the authenticity and integrity of the collection. Okay, so lastly, I thought I would introduce a small test just to help tidy up your knowledge. Don't worry, you don't need to submit this or anything. The answers are about to come in 2 seconds. Feel more than free to pause the video, look at the questions, see how you get on, and then I will give you the response in the next 2 or 3 seconds. I'll give you the answers in the next 2 or 3 seconds. Okay. And of course, here are the test answers. So generally speaking, no, archival catalogues tend to be hierarchical with multiple levels. According to those two items would be siblings. The parent would have essentially 1 less 1, and the child would essentially have 1 more 1 because it's a more specific unit of description. And the last one was also false. Archival catalogues should go from the general to the specific. For example, you would not aim to describe an individual item in the CLD or collection level description. Okay, and lastly, there's some further reading which I thoroughly recommend, especially Laura Miller's book. That's a really good book, and I think it really explains the basics of archival cataloguing in a way that is probably a lot better than I could in a 15-minute video. So thanks again. If you've enjoyed this video, feel more than free to leave any comments below and make any suggestions. I would be absolutely delighted to hear them. Thanks again. And if you enjoy these videos, I would be extremely grateful if you could like, subscribe, and share. And also just to remind you that I would be absolutely delighted to take any requests for future videos also.